Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Knoll. I'm giving a talk today on silence in organizations, and I'm speaking to you from Leipzig University, where I speak in front of an empty room, in front of a camera, and talking to a screen. And but even under this circumstance, I think it's a great honor for me to be able to give you a talk, be invited to give you a talk at your conference. And I hope you'll find something interesting in this talk. And I'm talking about silence in organizations, and I have a hidden agenda and an official agenda. And the hidden agenda is caused by my own interest in the field, and I think it's a very important topic. I'm thinking about this topic for quite a while, and so I'm personally involved. And so every time I talk about the topic, I also want to raise awareness from the audience, from people attending to these talks or to the lectures, and raise awareness on silence at their own workplaces and beyond in their own life. And I also try to give some hints to say, okay, where are we now, and what are the blind spots? Because even if I do research on this topic for quite a while, I'm still dissatisfied with what I have achieved and what we have achieved, because there are many cases where we see that silence has detrimental effects. And even if we do research on this topic for a while, we know quite a lot about it. There's still obviously a gap in a way that we can change things to the better. So the third point of my hidden agenda that I hope you forget in a minute, because it's hidden, is to maybe raise your interest in joining us, researchers on this field, and to support us or be part of our community to overcome the detrimental effects of silence at work and beyond. So please forget the hidden agenda. Let's talk about the official agenda for today, the aims of my talk. I want to present the state of the knowledge. Where are we now as researchers on silence? I want to suggest some ways to proceed, where I think the field can move towards. And on the third point, I want to link the topic of voice and silence to current challenges in the world of work. I think we all notice that things are not getting better everywhere. There are a lot of jobs, a lot of branches, and also in many countries, we still have working conditions that are problematic. We see rising numbers in people with work-related health issues, especially psychological health, mental health. And so I think that silence is, on one point, one of the reasons for negative health, but even more important, I think, that speaking up and raising your voice can be one way to overcome negative working conditions, to improve working conditions for yourself and also for others. And if people withhold their views, withhold their ideas, concerns, ideas, questions, this will not change things. So that will make things worse. And so I want to advertise also the attitude towards speaking up, to address, and how at this third point I want to show or explain how the current challenges in the world of work, or two selected challenges, are related to silence and voice, and how silence and voice may make a difference. Okay. Regarding the state of the knowledge, I thought it might not be too interesting for you to speak about every study and every detailed finding that is in the field. So there are a lot of good review papers on this, for example, by Morrison and also by Scherf et al. But so you find these details there. And what I want for this more interesting in the talk is that I organized this review along 6 takeaway messages, so that even if you're not interested in too much detail and you're not a silence researcher or even a researcher at all, maybe you're a practitioner, I hope you can take something from my review of the field. So I organized it around these 6 takeaway messages. So the first takeaway messages that I already gave a hint is that silence can be detrimental. What you see here are media coverages or pictures from the media that show us that silence is happening in different professions, different branches, different countries. And I took some exemplary situations, for example, that was abuse in the military, a picture that you see on the left-hand side at the bottom, or abuse in schools and also in sports institutions. And what we see in these cases is that very harmful things happen to people who need protection, so cadets in the military or pupils in schools or young people who are joining sports institutions. And what we learned from these cases is that people knew about difficult things, about unethical criminal acts, harmful acts, but they didn't speak about it. And so cohorts of other people went through these institutions and were harmed because things weren't raised and weren't brought on the agenda. And we also see in the middle, you see so cases of corruption in the business world. You see the example of Volkswagen, but more recently you learn about things happening at Facebook, for example. So there needs to be someone, in this case, a whistleblower, who raises attention to these cases, because within the organization it seems to be there's a culture of silence, climate of silence, because those things are not discussed. And we also see what you, I have some pictures on the right-hand side. You see cases of bullying, you see cases of very detrimental working conditions, for example, in the healthcare system, and people don't speak about it, remain silent on these cases and these issues, and people get harmed because people don't change these circumstances. And if you see the picture, you may assume that silence is only about those big issues, those things that are covered in the media, like the Me Too movement. But what we are interested in as a silence researcher is maybe even more the everyday issues, so that you notice that your supervisor does something that you would not support, or you think is inefficient, you think is maybe not the best way things should be done, or you are asked to do things and you would like to do the things different because you think of better ways to do it. But often people do not speak up about this. They don't raise their voice, they remain silent, withhold their views, withhold ideas for improvement, or to prevent negative things from happening. For example, that projects fail. At the end they say, oh, I knew it all along, but I didn't speak up on this. And so these are everyday issues. Almost every day we are in situations where we think, yeah, we could address these critical issues, but how often do we do it? You can ask yourself, if you were an audience here and not there are only empty chairs around me. If you were an audience, I would ask you, and then so you can also ask yourself at the moment, are there acts, how do I behave in these situations? So what does the research show? Indeed, there's some research showing that silence hampers organizational development, organizational learning, team learning. It reduces chances to detect errors and unethical behavior in the early stages. And we also see that silence marginalizes minority positions, and it also negatively affects the employee's own health. So there are different processes at the moment that are identified. On the one hand, silence harms people's health because it's demanding. If you suppress your thoughts, emotions, ideas, that this is something that takes a toll on you. and also an indirect effect because toxic environments stay in place if people remain silent. And one of the things that is not quite clear, even if we have this view that silence can be detrimental, as Shelby say that silence is bad at all, is all bad. And so aren't there also positive things in silence? And we think, or I think we should consider this as well, at least to think about this. Is this what we want, that people have to express all their thoughts, or shall they also have to write, for example, to withhold their views? And this is a pretty debated, hotly debated issue, because if you say there's a right to remain silent, it could be that other people get harmed because you want your right to remain silent on particular issues. So that's something that to be discussed, and I think there's no simple solution. But what we see is that silence can have a very harmful effect on other people and also on oneself. The second takeaway message is that the motives for silence are manifold. And you may stop the film or the video and ask yourself, why should employees withhold their views? What would be reasons to withhold ideas, concerns, or questions? And maybe what were your own motives in these situations? And of course, I would like to hear your points, but as this is not possible at the moment, I jump to the answers, or to what we think are the most important motives for people to remain silent. And we distinguished a number of silence types. And what we found is that resignation is a common motive. So people think that nothing will change anyway, even if they speak up. Fear is an important motive, that they fear that negative consequences will come up, negative career consequences, or fear even in a situation if you're sitting in a room with your boss, and there are bosses that shout at people and then have pretty a negative effect. So they people want to avoid this, and people fear, for example, all the loss of jobs, or then getting negative performance reviews and so on. Then we have pro-social silence, that people also remain silent to protect others, that they don't want to embarrass others, they want to protect the organization, and that's why they don't address critical issues. Another reason is opportunistic silence, that people are selfish, they want to avoid getting additional workload. You often hear that if I address this issue, then I have to deal with it, and I have to come up with a solution, and it's on my table to change things. So people want to avoid this. And other cases of opportunistic silence is that they want to protect their knowledge advantage, for example. They don't want to give their ideas away. And then you also have disengaged silence, that people just don't care about the issue and think that's not important enough that I get into the ring and fight for this thing. People also might have a lack of self-esteem, that they think they're not the person to raise this issue in a meeting in front of a big audience, or are not eloquent enough to speak about those issues with higher ups. And there's also deviant silence, or deviant silence, that people remain silent to harm others, that you notice that the project is going the wrong direction, but you don't like the person who is the project leader, and so you don't give your ideas and give your concerns and watch the project fail. These are the motives that we found, but yeah, I would like to hear your ideas as well. Do you think there are other motives? I think there's a quite heterogeneous audience out there, and you may come from different countries and different cultures, and there might be a different motives. So it would be great to hear if you think that we missed something, and hear your ideas on the topic. Another point is that silence is affected by factors at different levels. And what you see here is a slide that everyone would say, please avoid to put too many boxes on the slide. And it's far too much. But I don't think that's too complicated if you take a minute to read it. So what I want to show is that you have different levels. You see at the organizational level on the top, the team level in the middle, and the individual level below. And if you read it from left to right, you see the typical process model. You have antecedents, for example, organizational culture, that leads to organizational silence. In the middle, you have mediating processes. So the culture does not directly affect silence, but it affects what kind of organizational structures and policies are at stake, what kind of climate is emerging in an organization. And so you can read it on the horizontal line as what's happening on the different levels. For example, on the team level, you also have the team culture, manager characteristics, which influence leadership style and team structure and practices. Then you have the team climate, and then you have silence at the team level. And on the individual level, you have, if you read it from the left to right, you have traits, skills, motives from employees. Then these traits and skills and motives influence how people perceive situations, make sense of situations, and then they show silence or not. So, and what you also can see in this slide, that you also have cross-level effects, so that the organizational culture will affect the team processes and also the individual processes. So we also need to consider these kind of effects. And you see that, I don't know whether it's the best illustration, but I hope to show that you see that the organization is embedded in the societal culture. You have some kind of a figure ground distinction. On the ground, you have the societal level, because every organization is also embedded in the society and in the culture of the society, but also in the professional culture. For example, you have different cultures in the automotive industry compared to the healthcare sector or the social sector or the pedagogical sector. So we have to consider these influences as well. And of course, such a model is by far too complicated to test in the field, but I think it's important to know that all these factors might have an influence. And if you do a study, you would select the boxes, the processes, and the characteristics of the team, the organization, or the individual that you think is most important. But you should also think about the fact that other influences are also important. So to show what are the really important influences on the emergence of silence. And I give you some examples here from different studies. I don't want to go through these by detail, because I think you will have the slides and you can read it by yourself. And I also gave some references. And if you would like to do research on it, and if you think that there are other motives or other factors at individual, team, organizational level, of course, this would be a contribution, but even more of a contribution it would be if you can show that these additional factors have an incremental effect, because we often see so a proliferation of studies, for example, on leadership and silence, and then people always find that different kinds of positive leadership are negatively related to silence, and all the negative types of leadership, like abusive leadership or destructive leadership, are negatively or are positively related to silence. So they lead to more silence, and the positive forms of leadership lead to less silence. And of course, that is what we would expect, but to really make a contribution and be able to recommend leaders, for example, to behave in a particular way, or HR officers to select leaders, we need to compare the effects. So we need to have studies, for example, that include more than one leadership style to see whether there's an incremental effect. For example, if we include transformational leadership and authentic leadership and ethical leadership, then we would only be able to see what is the distinct effect, for example, of one particular kind of leadership style. The fourth takeaway message is that silence is a part of the social process. And often people view voice or silence as one-off events. So did people speak or did people withhold their views? And I think it's more helpful if we see it as a type of a process that starts with an environmental stimuli that is interpreted by a person. So you notice that something's happening, for example, inefficiency in a team, you sit in the meeting and people present something and you think, no, that will never work. So this is a stimuli that might be interpreted as what we call a latent voice episode. So an episode situation where voice could be an option. So you could say, okay, no, this won't work. But if you don't interpret this situation in this way, if you say, or if it's in your view that you would never question a supervisor who presents his or her project ideas, then you wouldn't interpret the situation as a latent voice episode. And what I want to show with this process model is that you go through different stages from noticing the situation as a situation that could require a voice to making a judgment on the situation. So, okay, I know voice would be an option, but will I engage in voice or will I remain silent? And then even after you have decided, okay, voice is an option, will you show this behavior or not? So this intention, do you form the intention, the motivation? Are you motivated enough? You know, okay, this is wrong, but will I really rock the boat and address this issue? Is it really so important for me? Is it the case so important? So this is the question of how high is your motivation? And then you come to the point where you show a voice or silence, and then you have the consequences. And what I want to illustrate here is that on each of these stages, there might be barriers that lead you away from addressing issues, and barriers that might motivate silence or facilitate silence. But you also see that there are context conditions and person characteristics, and as we say in the social sciences, that organization behavior, that behaviors always a function of the person, the context of the person and the situation and their interplay. So not surprisingly, we also in our model here, we have individual differences, person characteristics and context characteristics that function as moderators that might motivate or inhibit particular kind of behavior. I gave an example here for the first barrier. What Kennedy and Anderson, for example, found was that people in a higher position in the organization with a higher rank are less likely to detect unethical acts in their organization. So this is something that is a barrier between noticing the situation and interpreting the situation as a situation that requires voice. So an unethical situation would require voice because you would like to change the situation, and people in higher ranks are less likely to detect this unethical act. And what Kennedy and Anderson also found is identification was one of the mediators, identification with the organization. So they see their organization in a more positive light, and so they are less likely to notice critical situations like unethical acts. Okay, and also I want to encourage you to think about situations where you have remained silent on yourself, or where you notice situations where people didn't speak up, or cases in the media, and then you could analyze along this process model at which stage people came apart from the path to speaking about these situations. Another interesting study, in one of the few longitudinal studies on silence organization, is Perlow and Repenning's study, on a startup company in which they showed how silence unfolded in this organization, and how silence at the end destroyed the startup company. And while I drink, you may have a look at the maybe a bit unfamiliar illustration. So the idea here is that they have loops and circles, and what they found is, if you see on the, for example, on the left-hand side, there's people in this company remain silent to protect the relationship, and they didn't want to harm the relationship with their partners, so they didn't raise issues that they disagreed with the partner. And this tendency to preserve the relationship led to a spiral of silence. So they had the difficulties that they had and the differences that they had with their partners that manifested, that grew, and people got more and more dissatisfied with this situation, more and more frustrated. And what the result was that this silence that was initially planned to protect this relationship destroyed the relationship, that they, at the end they parted from these partners, and what they wanted to protect that they destroyed at the end. And what Knoll and Penning also found was a so-called speed trap, that the withholding of critical issues that seem to be negative for performance that piled up. So they had to work harder and faster to make up for this problematic situation, or because they did not address these critical issues, and they get caught into a speed trap, and there was even less opportunities to speak up. So this is a self-fulfilling process here, and self-accelerating dynamic, because you want to protect the positive relationship, so you remain silent, and then the relationship deteriorates, so it gets worse. And if the relationship is worse, you feel less willing to address critical issues, because it gets into an even hotter conflict, and people will not consider your position because you already have a negative relationship. And the same with the speed trap. You have less and less time to address critical issues, and silence gets more and more likely. So what we see is that it's a social process. We are influenced by other people, and this process unfolds over time and is self-accelerating. Another takeaway message is that silence can be contagious, and this insight comes from public opinion researchers Elizabeth Neumann in the 70s. She found that in public opinion, people who think they are in the majority are more likely to express their views. So this majority position gets more and more prominent, and more the obvious opinion in this context. And people who hold minority positions are less likely to express their views, because they fear negative consequences, they feel maybe insecure, and because of this process that they are less likely to express their views, their marginalized position gets even more marginalized. So that's a spiral, a downward spiral for minorities, and an upward spiral for majorities, or people in the majority position who think of themselves in the majority position. And the result is that the majority position seems to be without alternatives, and because the minority gets silent in this process. And Bowen and Blackman, who presented these two figures, use this to illustrate silence on non-heterosexual people in the workplace. So minority people who have in the minority group are less likely to express their views. And interesting in Bowen and Blackman's study is also that they found that if people withhold information on one point, so in this case it was their sexual orientation, they will also withhold the ideas on other points, on more work-related points. So we have also a spiral in this direction that other topics are withheld if people think they cannot express a particular part of their identity, and sexual orientation is just one. We also have class differences, or people from different backgrounds, ethnic minorities. So there are a lot of groups that are particularly likely to withhold their views because they see themselves in a minority position. And the last point is that silence does not always need to be a conscious choice. What I told you so far in this process model was that people notice that something might be wrong in the situation and that voice might be an option, and then they decide, and this decision is based on cost-benefit thinking. How much do I gain if I speak up? How much or how high is the risk of retaliation, for example? And in the context of psychological safety, they feel safe, they feel that there's no harm to be expected, and so they might speak up. So it's an elaboration on cost-benefit calculation. And but what we also see is that people might bypass this process. They might not elaborate on the situation at all. They might jump to the solution that the conclusion that they should remain silent in this situation. And one of the first studies who showed this were Dieter and Edmondson study on so-called implicit voice theories. And Dieter and Edmondson came to this idea by an observation that they noticed that in an organization, managers appeared open, and there were a lot of procedures in place that people can speak up, address their issues, but people remain silent anyway. So that they were looking for the explanation, and what they found is that people have implicit assumptions, so taken for granted assumption how to behave in a situation with people who are higher in the hierarchy. And what they found is that people have these taken for granted assumption, for example, that people, you see the 5 implicit voice theories here, that people think that it's harmful for other people if you criticize them, if you raise an issue, and that supervisors or people who initiated the process might feel personally offended if someone criticizes their process. And if this is the case, if you are socialized in this way, that you have this implicit assumption, you will not speak up, even if other people invite you, and even if you have formal voice opportunities, you will remain silent respectively. And you see here there are 5 of these theories. For example, also that speaking up has always negative career consequences, or that you need to have a solution to criticize something. So the idea is here that people think that if they criticize something, people expect that they come up with the solution to the problem as well. So you shall not address a problem if you don't have the solution. So, and this is something that does not need to be initiated by the co-on workplace. That might be something, as Dieter and Edmondson said, it might be learned in early socialization, for example, in schools, in sports institutions, or learn people with their parents at home that you should not question authority persons. And they bring these these ideas, these theories that they have to the workplace, and it's difficult for organizations to address these implicit theories because they are implicit. They are not consciously included in decision making, but they happen below the conscious threshold. Okay, these are state of notion 6 takeaway messages, and what I want to do next is to suggest some ways to proceed. And of course, this is not all what is known on silence and voice in organizations. It's a selection, but what we see is that there's research in many disciplines and research that uses many concepts. For example, for voice, you have issue selling, you have voice, you have whistleblowing, you have principled organizational dissent. So there are different concepts, different disciplines, so political science, for example, sociology, management research, different areas in psychology. So what I think one way to go forward is to develop so-called programmatic theories of the field. So what we have so far, I borrowed this slide from a recent paper by Cronin and colleagues. And what we usually see in the field is that more and more empirical research leads to the building of unit theories. And I already said that we have many studies that show the different kinds of leadership relate to silence. And that's where people often end in their research attempts. So they build unit theories. So we have many small theories. And what's needed is, as Cronin and colleagues say, for the field in general, but what I think is also important for silence research, that we have some kind of a programmatic theory, that we see that how can we integrate these different research streams, these findings from all over the world, from so many disciplines, into a programmatic theory, which could then also inspire application. And now you may ask, this sounds complicated, can you give some examples? Oh, well, by accident, I have some examples here. So for example, I showed you the process model, and what we see is that different literatures or different research streams use similar process models. And I have here two examples of helping behavior and unethical behavior. And what we see is that research on helping behavior have concepts such as the diffusion of responsibility or the bystander effect. And we could use findings from this research to inform why people stop at particular stages of the processes and engage in silence and do not engage in voice. And this research from helping behavior can help us understand, and we do not need to do the research ourselves, or do not need to reinvent these issues, but there's already a lot of research, a lot of knowledge out there. And it's similar for unethical behavior, where you have concepts such as moral licensing or moral disengagement. And these concepts can help us understand why people remain silent at work. So we would integrate these findings in some kind of an architecture process to develop a programmatic theory, and not stop with unit theories that are only addressing a particular insight, but to integrate it into an overarching process. Another example is to consider that silence can have many faces. And the person you see here is Albert Hirschman, one of the most important I would say pathfinders for voice research, with his book Exit Voice and Loyalty. And he said that people have different options to respond to dissatisfaction at work. And so they do not only have the chance to raise their voice or remain silent, they can also leave the organization. They can show loyalty, and they may also neglect the issue that they may think they cannot change or do not want to change. And I think there are many more response options. If you're in a situation where you think you could raise your voice, that you find and that lead to silence. An important thing is that to notice that if people leave the organization, then detrimental circumstances stay in place and stay intact and are potentially harmful to others. So we also to understand why silence endures in particular institutions. We should not only look at those who are still there, remain silent, but also look at those who quit the organization, left the organization, because this also contributed to silence. And so we can look into the different literatures that are contributing to these to response options and learn what these literatures can contribute to our understanding of voice and silence in organizations. And I again included the green-yellow statement in the colors of the conference to give you some food for thought. What could be other concepts that are relevant here that could help us further develop our theory of silence in organizations? A third opportunity is to get into questions that are not answered in the literature yet, but that could benefit from research in other fields. And what we assume here is that silence, whether people speak up or remain silent, is also affected by who did the wrong thing or who did something unethical. And you got here some examples. Jimmy Savile, who was, after his death, only discovered as someone who sexually harassed children. But at his lifetime, he was highly praised, was a very prominent figure in the UK. And you also see Harry Weinstein, I think you know him, and also Larry Nassar, the gymnastics coach in the US gymnastics team. And he also abused athletes. And what you know is that these are important persons, important figures, people who contributed to the common good or to the organization. And it seems to be that it's particularly likely that if they do something wrong, people do not address this. And we need to understand this, and we do not have research in organization behavior literature yet, which is systematically addressing this point. But we have research in, for example, social psychology that show that the status affects who is trusted to do something wrong and who's not. And we also have research from moral disengagement research, for example, ethical behavior research that show that people, even if they are discovered, they are protected by other people. And what I think is important that we also include this knowledge into our theory building and try to transfer it to the organizational behavior literature. Okay, these are the first two parts, aims of the talk. So I presented the state of the knowledge, and I suggested ways to integrate knowledge and ways to proceed. And now in the third and last part, I want to link voice and silence to some challenges in the current world of work. And this part is inspired by a paper by Eisenhardt and colleagues on great challenges. So there are a lot of great challenges in the world of work, and I think as researchers we should link the concepts that we are investigating to these great challenges. Yeah, again, if you were an audience here, if I could interact with you, which would be nice, I could ask you, what do you think are the greatest challenges, or what are great challenges in the current world of work? And then I could ask how these challenges may relate to voice and silence. And I want to show this reasoning with two challenging challenges. One is globalization, and the other is flexible work arrangements. So I think we can agree that business becomes more and more globalized, more and more international. And we also can agree that there are more and more flexible work arrangements. And if we notice these things, we need to understand how these developments affect performance, well-being of employees, learning, and so on. But in particular, as researchers interested in voice and silence, we need to understand how do these developments affect voice and silence, and how which role does voice and silence play in these processes. And what I think is important is to learn how cultural characteristics function as antecedents of silence and voice. So are people from different parts of the world, do they have a higher or lower tendency to engage in silence and voice? And also silence could be a mediator between antecedents and consequences. So for example, between negative supervisor behavior or autonomy at the workplace, and a mediator could be silence to health conditions, for example. And another potential influence of globalization, besides functioning in cultural characteristics as antecedents of silence, could be that we have a greater group of immigrants. So there are more immigrants who are integrated into the workforce. We have a more diverse workforce. We have a lot of marginalized groups, and we need to understand their tendency to express their views. And one study, I think it's also the first study that in a more systematic way addresses international differences in people's tendency to remain silent, is a study that we published this year. You see here Hassan, as one of the co-organizers of the conference, was one of my partners in this project, along with partners from 33 countries. And I know that it's difficult to understand what is on the slide. I did this by purpose to invite you to have a look at the paper. What I show, or what I want to show, is that we found differences. You see this on the map, differences in the tendency to engage in silence. You see here the example of quiescent silence. But what you also see is a weakness of the study, that we did not cover all parts of the world. And this weakness that our study shares with many studies, that, for example, in Africa or also Latin America, you have very little research, and more research on the Northern Hemisphere in Europe. And so that are the countries that we investigated. And you see with the violin plots on the lower left hand side of the screen, that there are differences. You see that the violins differ. And for the different countries, each violin stands for one country, and with the colors for cultural clusters. So in this paper, we try to identify similarities and differences in silence tendencies in four motives of silence. And what we also wanted to show is whether cultural characteristics like power distance or collectivism are related to voice and silence tendencies. Besides this factor, I already mentioned that we get a larger group of immigrants all over the world. There's a greater fluctuation, and people coming to different countries, trying to work there. And my view is, and I also share this view with Harrison and colleagues, who did a lot of research on immigrants. And it seems to be that these groups are particularly likely to withhold their views. And what you see here is that some motives or some reasons why this is the case might be that they are already in a lower position, they already have no resources, and speaking up might be a threat, or they might appear to them as an additional threat, so that they will lose even more resources. So based on the conservation of resources theory, we could explain that silence is larger or more likely in immigrant groups. But as I mentioned, there's very few research on this topic. There might also be that immigrants are not familiar with implicit norms in organizations or in these countries, so they don't feel secure to address these issues. There might be language barriers, and also there might be the case that often immigrants are in lower jobs in the lower hierarchy, so they already have stressful jobs, and what we know from longitudinal studies that poor health leads to more silence. So if people already have health conditions, they or have problems managing their workload, silence is more likely, and this might be the case for immigrant groups as well. So this is also a field where there's not so much research or no research yet, but an important field and important development in our society. Besides globalization, I mentioned that there are more flexible work arrangements, and these flexible work arrangements are particularly driven by digitalization. So you have more technology available. This allows you to work more flexible. We see this simulated here, that I give a talk to you even if I'm not there. So we somehow work together over a distance of space and even distance of time. So I tell you a secret that it's not really the 16th of November right now, but you should not, it's not a problem. So we see we can still work together, think together on these issues, and driven by these digital technologies. But this might be a problem if conversation and communication is distributed or dispersed over time and space. People are not present in the office, for example, or on the shop floor at the same time. This might cause a lot of problems as well. It has a lot of positive things, but might also cause a lot of problems. And it might also affect people's tendency to express or withhold their views. And here I have a model or an evolution of models that is in the paper that is currently under review. And here we tried to approach this topic of flexible work arrangement and digital technologies and voice. And what is you see on the top is the usual question: are people more likely to express their views in flexible work arrangements or when using digital technologies than when working in regular office or traditional office, or when speaking face-to-face? And the point that we want to make in this paper is that this is a very deterministic and very narrow and simplistic view, that it's more important to understand that what are the factors that are affected by these flexible work arrangements. So try to see the picture from the right-hand side, so from the result. We say, okay, what is meant by voice? So then we present this process model. And we say, okay, you have these different stages, and which factors are important that people move through these stages or stop at these barriers. And then in the third step, we start thinking about, okay, how do flexible work arrangements and digital technologies affect these voice success factors of these processes. And then we need to understand what you see as models 3A and 3B. What are the processes? What are the effects? And what we see here is that we are likely to have conditional indirect effects. We don't have direct effects of flexible work arrangements on voice, but we have indirect effects through voice success factors. For example, if you work in a flexible work arrangements, you might have less trust to your colleagues because you don't see them that often, or because you don't see their feedback, or only see the feedback on the screen and not in reality, which is not such a rich feedback. And so this makes you less likely to express your views. And so we see this process, and in this paper we even want to get a step further, because we question whether these models 3A and B, which are the established models are really reflecting reality, because more recent models, so-called social material approaches, say there are no flexible work arrangements and technologies which are separated, but they always are in the process. They always are linked to each other, and we cannot understand the phenomenon by looking just at flexible work arrangements and digital technologies, but we need to see them in concert with each other. So we came up with this model, and I think you already notice the lower horizontal line, which is our process model, and in the middle you see the processes that are likely to influence whether people move through these stages, and on top you see illustrated as the working in concert of what offers the technology, affordances and constraints of the technology such as Zoom, and the goals and the capabilities of the users, and that they work together to influence factors that might in the end influence decisions to express your views or remain silent. Okay, and again, you can ask what are other challenges, how may they be related to voice and silence, and the ability and motivation to speak. Okay, and now I'm already coming to an end, to the end of my brief talk today. The 3 aims, you see them here, and the only thing that is missing are the four most important words in research, and this is, what do you think? And unfortunately, we don't have the chance to exchange right now, but if you want to, feel free to write and share your ideas, or do your own studies and start doing research in this field. It was a pleasure to give this talk, even under these circumstances, and I would be happy to get some feedback from your side. Thank you very much.